Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries, an organization that exists to connect the Christian faith with the realities of everyday life. As always and ever, I'm Scott Jones, your host, and we come to you every Friday, although apologies that it's coming out a little late on Saturday morning today, but normally we do come to you every Friday to discuss, among other things, the contents of our weekly wrap-up post, Another Week Ends, which is sort of like our Christian grace-infused cosmopolitan guide to the contents of the interwebs as we see them for the week. In just a few moments, I'll be joined by the usual suspects, David Saul and Sarah Condon, to talk about the contents of Another Weekends. But first, I had the privilege this week of talking with Suzanne Stabile. She's the co-author with Ian Morgan Cron of a great new book on the Enneagram called The Road Back to You. It's a great book, and I had a great conversation with Suzanne. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Suzanne, welcome to the Mockingcast.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Now, I just want to assure you of a few things, that I will not in this interview tell you that you're too much or overbearing, that I will thank you for all that you do and for how attentive you are in the interview. And well, if you help me to be successful in the interview, I promise I will notice your efforts. I'll take an interest in you. And I really do want to know what you need.
Great.
So these are the, of course, how to get along with me tips from the Ennea app for the two on the Enneagram. So
that's fascinating.
One of my co-hosts on the show, Sarah Condon, is a 3 on the Enneagram. And so after I was reading your book, I called her. We talk frequently. I said, Sarah, I just want to tell you, I admire you. And she said, oh, bless your heart. I called my co-host to tell her I admire her because I was getting tips about how to get along better with the 3s in my life. So
there you go.
You and your friend Ian Morgan Cron have written a great book called The Road Back to You, an Enneagram journey to self-discovery. So are you walking around all the time trying to guess people's Enneagram types?
Absolutely not.
Really?
Yeah, I never have tried. I'll tell you why. Your Enneagram number is determined by your motivation and not by your behavior. So for the most part, it's a waste of time for people to walk around trying to figure out the numbers of other people. If you're not in conversation with somebody or in a relationship, or if you don't know them well, then the chances of you being wrong by assigning an Enneagram number to them based on behavior patterns is high.
Have you ever tried to guess the types of favorite TV characters or movies?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like the serial drama where you get so involved in the characters' lives that you want to put them on your prayer list?
I woke up this week worried about the designated survivor guy.
Me too. I haven't seen this week's episode yet, but me too. I love that show.
I woke up thinking, I wonder if he's okay.
It really is a hopeful show about politics. I mean, when you compare it to House of Cards or something like that.
Yeah. I think so too. And that's what I would want, of course, as a hopeful, kind human being.
What was your reaction when you first found your Enneagram type?
Well, that was a very long time ago. But when I read in the first edition of Richard Rohr's book, when I read 2s, I knew that was me. And I felt both exposed and affirmed at the same time. And it's interesting for me because I'm an adopted child. I was adopted at birth.
Me too. Yeah.
Well, I don't know how that affected you. I keep finding out how it affected me. But great parents adopted me and raised me and took great care of me and loved me very well. But when I was little, my parents had 2 biological children when I was born, boys, both 18 and 15. And they all looked alike, and I didn't look like anybody. So I can remember as a child paying attention to people's behavior to see who I was like, because I didn't look like anybody. And so it was fascinating to me to read something that captured both my behavior and the reason I did the things that I do. And I was kind of overwhelmed when I first read my number. And then I was very curious about everybody else's.
My wife says that what she likes about the Enneagram as opposed to other personality tests is it starts off with, look, who you are is probably born out of a lot of fallenness, fragility, brokenness in the world, and it's left some primal wounds. But you know what? There's hope, as opposed to sort of, it is certainly a test that assumes a pretty realistic theological anthropology. It doesn't make us better than we are.
Exactly. And I think we know ourselves by what we get wrong, not by what we get right. So I think I was challenged by a group of people to teach an Enneagram Know Your Number workshop is what we call it in LTM. And I was challenged to teach a workshop with only the positive attributes of each number, and nobody got their number.
That's like the naive optimistic approach.
Yeah. And the thing about the Enneagram that's different from every other system that I'm aware of is that you can do something with what you learn. It's not just an identification of you out of a group of people. But if you go beyond just finding out what your number is, there are things you can do that grow your soul and make your life much better.
Well, one of the things I like most about your book is the way you organize it, because I just felt like in a section on page 27, you talk about the triads. And when I read it, I thought, wow, I don't know that I've ever seen it just put this clearly. So you just sort of say, hey, there's 9 types. Within that, there's sort of 3 subgroups. There's the anger or gut triad. That's 8, the challenger, 9, the peacemaker, and 1, the reformer. And these are driven primarily by this kind of gut level anger. 8s externalize it, 9s forget it, try to suppress it, and 1s internalize it.
Right.
And they take and respond to life instinctively at the gut level. Then you get the feeling or the heart triad. The emotion triad, 2, 3, 4, and they're driven by feelings. 2s focus outwardly on the feelings of others. 3s have trouble recognizing their own or others. And 4s concentrate inwardly on their own feelings. And then you got the fear or head triad, 5, 6, 7. The 5, your investigator type, they externalize the fear. 6 forgets it, and 7 internalize it. So you sort of got the 3 moves related to each of the 3 parts of the triad. Right. How did you come up with that?
I learned it from other people who had done the work before me. That's not my work, nor is it Ian's. That's been available information for quite a while. Rizzo and Hudson have that information. Hurley and Donson, Richard Rohr.
Yeah, I was thinking more like, I guess the concepts weren't new to me, but the choosing to organize the book that way, like structurally. I think like you organize. I've never seen an Enneagram book organized by subtypes, by the triads, and I actually found that incredibly helpful.
Right.
To the sort of the way you organize it, because it kept things really straight for me and helped me understand the relationships between the types a lot better than I had before.
Well, and one of the reasons we did that is because I like to teach in triad order. So people who start teaching with a 1 and then go to 2, 3, 4, by 1 and 2, they've been in 2 triads with none of that explained. So if you start with 8s and you finish the triad that's at the top of the Enneagram, then you have to start with 8s in order to get to 1 in a pattern that makes sense to me for teaching. Because once I put 8, 9, and 1 on the table, then I can help them differentiate how they're different from one another based on anger. Because 8 angers straight up and then it's over, and 9 angers passive aggressive, and 1 anger is resentment. So they know they're kind of like these people. They all know that just under the surface there's anger. So then what is the piece that tells them how they're different from those 2 numbers in their triad?
You have a ministry called Life in the Trinity Ministry, which is a great name for a ministry. Do you think some of your connection to the Enneagram is what I would say is the perichoretic nature of the thing, in that all the types are, just like you can't know the Father without the Son, and you can't know the Son and the Father without the Spirit. You can't know your type without knowing the type you move towards in your integrating moments or disintegrate to in your really broken moments. So you're always sort of like, it's like, I think in a perichoretic view of the world, which I think is just true because God is triune, every truth tends to be relative to some other truth that's in relationship to. You can't know things totally discreetly in reality. Right. So is that part of the draw to you for the Enneagram?
Yes, it is, because I think, I've been teaching for 25 years, long time. And there are people occasionally who want me to prove the Enneagram. They want to argue with me about its validity and all that. And I'm pretty laid back about that. I don't need anybody to appreciate or buy into Enneagram wisdom. But my answer to people is just live with it for a while, because it's just true. It's true information. And if you can allow it in, it not only will tell you the truth about you, but it will tell you the truth about how to have more compassion and more understanding and more concern for the common good and for other people.
What's the best way for someone to assess their type? You have a favorite test? You have a favorite sorter? You have a favorite?
I'm a kind of a holdout on that. I don't approve of the tests at all. I or the indicators or whatever we want to call those. The Enneagram is probably 3,500 years old, and it was an oral tradition until the 1970s.
Wow.
Yep. Nothing was published until then. There were notes and journals, but nobody was publishing books about the Enneagram. And if an oral tradition lasts that long, then there is something about the value of teaching it orally, I think. I, along with my husband, who is a former Catholic priest, he left the priesthood at 40, and he's been a United Methodist pastor for the last 28 years. And we, from time to time, we skip a couple of years and then we start it again because we have a center here in Dallas. And we do an Institute for Spiritual Formation. We offer a 2-year program that's an Institute for Spiritual Formation. And what we found out was if we used an indicator the first session and then 2 months later came back and I taught it orally, that the indicator proved to not be correct a high percentage of the time. And I think as I have looked at the indicators of the tests over the years, I think it's because it's very difficult to measure motivation in the number of questions that you would have to ask to help somebody figure out what their number is. The reality is we all do the same things. So the question gets to be, why do we do them? So I really think, and this sounds so self-serving that it's embarrassing for me. But I really believe that the best opportunity people have for a way who can't be in a workshop where it's taught live is with a book like ours that's narrative style, that's easy to access. I think most people who read the book will know their number when they finish.
How often do you think people with like indicators and tests and stuff mistest? I mean, have you seen a lot of mistesting?
It's very high. The percentage is very high.
Yeah, I in my experience too, I think sometimes it can be, I think you're right, it is more of an intuitive process.
Right.
Where you sort of step through the doorway and see the room and you're like, oh, this is my room right here.
Right. And because I use storytelling when I teach, so many people come to me and say, I wasn't sure until you told that story about your next door neighbor. And I thought, oh, that's me for sure. That's exactly what I would do. So I think I think we need the stories. I think that's the best hospitality we have to offer one another is our stories. And I think in the storytelling, people find themselves as one of many instead of separating themselves from the others and thinking that they're autonomous in some way, which just refers back to what you said earlier about the Trinity.
What are other types that you like? Do you have a favorite type that you like to spend time with? Like if you were going to plan a day that was going to be really like fun or life-giving or restorative, like is there a type that's like particularly you're fond of for that sort of pursuit?
Well, I would have to put in a disclaimer. My favorite person on the planet is my husband. And
what is your husband's type?
He's a 9. So he's always my first choice. However, our children are 4 different numbers.
Wow.
7, 8, 9, and 4. And I like to be with them for different reasons. And we have 6 grandchildren, and I like to be with them depending on what I want to do or what kind of mood I'm in or what my needs are. They each meet those needs from their number as well. So I can't say that for all activities I would have a favorite, but I would have a favorite depending on the activity, if that makes sense. Joe always being the top pick.
Well, at least you have a 7 in there with your kids. So if you need to like party and
he
have a little bit of smell the roses a bit.
A lot of humor from him.
You talk about in the book about how to use the Enneagram for spiritual formation, right? And I mean, how do you do? I think like this is the biggest challenge I think with spiritual formation. How does it not become something like a form of law or rule oriented in the worst sense, and really become a gracious gift to being yourself? I mean, how can you use the Enneagram in a way that doesn't feel, I feel like if we feel constrained. Like when we really feel free is when the is and the ought line up and there's not a external.
Sure.
So how do you use it in a way that facilitates the journey, a gracious journey of real self-awareness?
I think the best thing for us to begin with in talking about that question is that the Enneagram shows you the best part of you, and then you discover that it's also the worst part of you. And so in a culture when we have a tendency to truncate everything, when we manage things by disposing of whatever doesn't fit, it's an interesting journey for us to have the responsibility of putting our arm around the reality that you can't get rid of this part of you. You have to make it healthy. You have to grow in it. You have to be more mature in it. So an example for me as a 2 is I'm a giver. I'm a helper and I'm a giver. And sometimes my giving is altruistic and I'm called to do it and it's pure. And sometimes my giving is to get something in return and it's manipulative and it's controlling. So I think the fact that you can't get rid of what you don't like in the wisdom of the Enneagram means that you can love yourself more through the journey because you don't want to get rid of a part of you. You don't want to do without a part of you. When I start to teach a Know Your Number workshop, I say, by the end of the day, I think most of you will know your number. What I know is that everybody in the room will be more compassionate. Because we live under the assumption, not that we're all the same, but we do live under the assumption that we all take in the same information when we observe something. And we absolutely do not. And that's what determines your Enneagram number.
You tell a really moving story in the book about a parent. It's like when a parent, their kid first gets glasses and they see the prescription and they realize, oh my God, I can't believe my kid was seeing the world this way.
Right.
And that's, so much the nature of sometimes when you work with something like the Enneagram, you see that, wow, 2 of us can stand in the same place at the same moment and experience something completely different.
That's right. That's right. And how you take in that information determines what triad you're in. And what you lack in processing that information determines what Enneagram stance you're in.
How is it working with a 4 on the book? Ian's a 4.
Well, we share a line on the Enneagram. So that means that I am usually focused outward and he, as a 4, is usually focused inward. So when we meet in the middle of that, there's a mix. There's a goodness about our work together and our being able to focus both inside of ourselves and outside ourselves in terms of what we're trying to offer to other people. Ian is one of the best writers I've ever read. His other 2 books are equal to this one. Jesus, My Father, the CIA, and Me is his memoir, and it's really good. And Chasing Francis is a novel based on some true stuff, and it's really good too. So if I have all of this material and I want it to be in the world, and Ian called me on a Sunday afternoon and invited me to write an Enneagram book with him. And I had said I would never write one, that I thought it should be oral. But he gave me some very compelling reasons for why we should do it.
What were they?
And he believes that, one thing he believes is that in evangelical circles, the Enneagram is new.
Yeah.
And that it offers people within evangelical systems and churches a way to talk to one another about the differences in how they see the world without being dismissive and without having to be right. You can have 2 right answers instead of just 1, or 7 right answers instead of just 1. And I had gotten to a point, because the Enneagram's pretty hot right now, where I was saying no to 2 opportunities for every one that I could say yes to. And so I realized I wasn't going to be able to get in the room with people and teach them their number. I was going to have to let go of some of that. And I think we did a really good job of capturing each number and making it, I know I've already said this, but it's so important, making it appropriately accessible for everybody. Do you notice as a 2, do you ever somatize? All the 2s I know, not all of them, but several of them. Like, it just seems like because that's the most purely, they say, right, interconnected, interpersonal of all types. I mean, you're walking in the room, you just feel all the energy. And sometimes that manifests itself in somatic stuff in the body. And do you Sure.
notice that with 2s?
Yeah, quite a bit. I think the thing that's most important to say about 2s in relation to that question is that we feel other people's feelings and not our own. So when I walk into a room and I feel the feelings of everybody in the room, it's often more than I can carry. Physically, it's more than I can handle. twos also don't have any boundaries, so they don't have good ones. So they don't know how to say no to people. So they just wear themselves out, giving and giving and giving, hoping that somebody's going to want them. And so there's some reality behind the exhaustion that goes with how they are in the world that creates physical symptoms that they need to listen to.
My wife is a 2, and I think she is always, so many women test as 2s, right? And so, or come out, or I wonder, like, is it, how much of that is because, my wife really, I mean, she would say it fits her pretty well, but I mean, how often do women test as 2s just because we sort of socialize women? Okay, you need to be the nurturer, you need to pay attention, you need to, like, it's almost, it's like a false positive almost because of gender stereotypes sometimes.
Exactly. If I do a women's retreat using the Enneagram and there are 150 women there, probably 50 or 60 will identify as 2s on the Enneagram, and probably only 20 of them are really 2s.
Yeah, that's so. Is that? I mean, I think that if you feel like is a woman that you've been put in this helper role a lot. I mean, I can. It seems like sometimes the identification can be hard sometimes.
Yeah. It's especially true in my generation. So I was born in 1950, but for baby boomers, we still, as women, were born into that role that 2s kind of define. But younger, my daughters and women their age don't misidentify nearly as often. And with a little work, I can help in a workshop the women who have identified as 2s to recognize that they're probably another number. And often they're 6s.
Is there a type that you think masks as a type often? Like, are there certain types that, okay, so what are the most common things that it looks like this, but really they're this?
A counterphobic 6 masks as an 8 frequently. 2s and 9s look very much alike, and 3s and 8s look very much alike, particularly female 3s and 8s.
So 4, 5, or 7, you're pretty. They're easier. They have less of a thing that.
4 is the least common number and the most complex on the Enneagram, and you pretty much know if you're a 4, and other people know it. 1s have a deal breaker. So 1s hear a constant critic. They have a voice that's a critic that is never kind to them and doesn't give them any attaboys. And that critic is consistent all day and all night, all the time. And other numbers don't have that. We all have self-talk, but we don't have that. So once that's well explained to 1s, they know whether or not they're a 1. 7s and 4s you can't tell apart as little kids. They look exactly the same. But starting in late adolescence, they begin to show themselves as one or the other of those two numbers.
Why is that? Why do 7 and 4s look the same?
I think it's because they're neither one ever satisfied. They always want more for different reasons, but they always want more. And they are not emotionally available in average space. 4s and 7s are available when they're feeling really good and when they're feeling really low. But in average space, they're generally kind of checked out. And so it's hard to read that when their emotional expressions are often kind of over the top.
That's really interesting. In your work, teaching the Enneagram, and like you said, most of it's been oral and through teaching and workshops. I mean, are there like moving things that stand out, like the person for whom life was really hard and getting a gracious window into themselves where the lights went on and things came together?
I think, how Paul says, I don't know why I do the same thing over and over. I try really hard to not do that, and I do it anyway. Well, everybody says that. We all feel that way. And as soon as you learn the Enneagram and somebody explains to you why you do the same thing over and over and over, then it's almost like that awareness opens the door for the grace that allows you to let it go. You can just let some behavior go. But we are so controlling, and we're not people who allow well. So we have to learn to allow these parts of what we would call false personality to fall away. The other truth is, if you hear all 9 numbers taught, then while you might not like everything about your number, You for sure don't like everything about the other 8 numbers. And it's kind of like, I know this is messed up, but it's my mess. And I'm going to hang right here. I can't imagine being any of these other numbers.
Suzanne, can you guess my type yet? Like, you're an expert, 25 minutes,
I haven't been trying to guess your type, but I would say that I think you're probably in the head triad.
A what?
So that would be head triad.
Ah, interesting. I am a 4 as thorough as gets, but with a lot of, I like theology and stuff like that. So I've lived a lot in academic circles, but it's all heart for me.
Interesting, because you ask head questions.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, so if I had picked a number, if I'd picked 1 instead of a triad, I would have picked 5.
That's interesting. Yeah, I also have ADHD. So when I took the test, I thought I was a 7.
Yeah.
That's why I was interested by what you said about the 7 and the 4s, because there's a restlessness and a kind of, I'm probably 4 with a 3 wings. So it's kind of it's probably the more extroverted side of the 4. And so
right.
Very interesting. So that was my narcissistic moment for the interview.
You're allowed 1.
Exactly. So, you also have a podcast.
We do.
Where you interview.
Back to you.
Where you interview people of different types.
Right.
So what's been one of the most interesting folks you've had on recently?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked, because I would love to talk about this today. Michael Wear, his last name is spelled W-E-A-R. And Michael started working in the White House at 19, and he's 27 or 28. And he was the guy who was responsible for faith and politics. And he's a 4 on the Enneagram, and we had an opportunity to have him on our show. And we didn't know him. We just had heard a little bit about him and heard that he had been in the Obama White House to work with faith and politics. So we had a connection, and he came to be on our show. And everything I'm doing right now, I taught all day yesterday, and I have a couple of podcasts today. And everything I'm doing right now, I tell people that if you never listen to another one of the podcasts of The Road Back to You, please, right now, before you vote, go listen to Michael Wear on The Road Back to You, because he has an unending wisdom, I found, and brilliance about talking about politics in a way that doesn't align him with either party, and it doesn't he's not putting anybody down. He's just saying, here are the things you can do. So here's an example. I asked him to talk about some things we could do leading into the last, 5 or 6 weeks of the election. He said, well, people expect things from the government that the government is not responsible for giving us. He said, for example, people want to get their inner needs met by politicians and by the government. And that's the work you do with Jesus. That's not what all this is for. So you need to approach politics in a completely different way. It gave me so much peace about an election that I think has been so crazy, because it gave me a place to stand. So he's one of my very, very favorites.
Have you found the Enneagram sometimes gives you a win? Like I found at cocktail parties, it's given me a way to connect with people beyond the surface. Like where all this, and it's fun. Like, I have several apps on my phone, and we'll just play around that, because people generally like to talk about themselves, right? And sometimes all of a sudden you get this capacity to just get in a way that you might not normally have in those contexts.
Right. We do an advanced boot camp, we call it, which is a terrible name, but we do 5 days in August in Dallas.
How many push-ups do I have to be able to do before I can go to them?
You got to have done some Enneagram work. So when people have done a fair amount of Enneagram work, they can come to that event. And we usually have about 150, 180 people. And this year we did it for the 3rd time, and there were people who had been to all 3. And one of the most astonishing things I found out is that lots of them who know one another in talking about deep and important things have no idea what the others do for a living. They don't know what their job is. Some of them don't know where they live, because they don't talk about that. Those are not the starter questions. It's not, hi, my name's Suzanne. Hi, I'm Fred Flintstone. Well, what do you do? What do you do? They don't even know that, because they start conversation on a different level because they know the Enneagram. So when you come into an event like that and say, hi, my name's Suzanne, I'm a 2, and you say, hi, my name's Scott, and I'm a 4, then we have a different conversation to have.
Are there ever moments where you're like, in your disintegrated moments where you're like, gosh, I'm such a Enneagram teaching fraud. Like, gosh, why am I not more self-aware? I mean, is that like all our virtues or our vices, right? I mean, is it a vice of being sort of an Enneagram teacher that like, oh my gosh, why don't I have it more together?
I hope this doesn't sound terribly arrogant, but I don't feel that way. And I regret making bad choices, and I often feel like I'm not a good enough human being. But I don't feel like a fraud ever. I'm pretty, what you see is what you get, and I've changed so much. I've transformed so much. Let me say that differently. I've experienced so much transformation with the use of the Enneagram that I know that's an ongoing thing. And I think if we're too hard on ourselves, it just stops the process. It just means we stop. But I can see why you would ask that question, because the number one most important thing to 4s on the Enneagram is that they be authentic. Authenticity is everything. And so anytime you're inauthentic in order to try to kind of be seen and know other people, you have to sell out to get what you want. It's like 4s want relationships almost more than anything, but you feel like you have to be a fraud to be in relationship with somebody because they can't handle the intensity of your 4-ness.
Do you feel like, as someone who's a 2 and you kind of integrate to the 4, is the teaching and an invitation to like write this book with your friend, are these spaces where you could sort of move into healthy forms of self-expression? Like, hey, I can kind of be a little more artistic, creative, worry a little more about what I'm feeling about this stuff and how to gift that to others, as opposed to sort of a kind of meeting needs out of a external kind of pressure?
Yeah, Ian's very creative, so that that helped because every word matters to him, and every concept and every story matters to me. Now they do for him too, but I think I believe this. I know that the Enneagram makes people's lives better, and I know that the Enneagram makes people better people. And that's kind of motivation enough to figure out a way to say things so that people can hear it. So let me give you an example. My daughter's an 8 on the Enneagram, and that's one of my daughters, the oldest, and that's a very aggressive number, and culturally we don't have a lot of appreciation for female 8s. And she called me one morning. She's been doing Enneagram work since she was 20, so she's in deep. And she called me one morning and she said, Mom, I don't think the golden rule applies to 8s. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, I treat people exactly like I want to be treated, and it never goes well. And it occurred to me that the golden rule doesn't really apply to any of us. We all want to be treated the way we want to be treated, and we all have different needs. And so once I started to take on that whole way of thinking around the pieces that I wanted in the book and the things that I wanted us to say in the book, I was constantly saying, when we wrote the 8 chapter, can an 8 hear this? And when we wrote the 5 chapter, can a 5 hear this? And that changes what you say when you're thinking about it from the perspective of the reader instead of from your own perspective. And I think the book reflects that, and I think that's why it's going to be a go-to Enneagram book.
Well, mission accomplished. I have spent a lot of time with Enneagram material, and I think this book is awesome. And I want all of our readers to get 2 copies. Get one for yourself and one for a friend. The Road Back to You, published by InterVarsity Press. And Suzanne, I have a confession to make.
What is it?
2s are generally my favorite type. Most of the people that have loved me well have been 2s. So.
Yeah. Well, put me on the list.
Thanks for doing this.
You're so welcome. I enjoyed it.
I can do. My gift is my song, yeah, and this one's for you. And you can tell everybody this is your song. It may be quiet.
I said a couple weeks ago that I wanted to track my performance based on grooming. And so this morning I have not showered or shaved. So normally I feel like in my own mind, that feels unprofessional, even though nobody can see me. And, my hygiene is generally above average. So one day, give or take, is not probably going to make or break things. But for people that are really listening, the 6 people that care, I have not showered. And I have a baseball cap on. Sarah is sans baseball cap. David has
sweatshirt.
Sweatshirt, Yale. And David has not had a haircut in a while. And it's not shaved.
It's true.
So this morning, I was walking the dogs, and one of my dogs peed on the other one's legs. I guess that was a form of bonding. And I was listening to Howard Stern, as is my custom, and Sting, they were playing an interview that he did with Sting this week. And after they play SOS to the World, Sting played the guitar, and then we started playing the bass. And in SOS to the World, he plays the bass, but now he's playing the guitar. And Stern asked about the bassist, and the bassist is actually standing in for Sting, who played the bass, is actually playing Sting's bass. He's like, do you have to play it just like Sting? He's like, well, no, he's a great bass. And then he says, well, it turns out, Howard, that actually the band playing right now I forget their name, but he's like, but they started in Texas. They were called La Polizia, and they were a police tribute band. He's like, so are we a little narcissist that you play with your own tribute band? So insecurity never ends. Okay, so like your Sting
That's
and
the
your
good
ego,
news.
your ego might be that fragile that you need you need to redo your greatest hits with a tribute band.
I think he's got a new record coming out this week.
He does.
Yeah,
that's why he was doing and he sounded great.
He looks extremely well preserved. Ridiculous. It's supernatural almost.
That's probably because he showers and shaves every morning.
No, it's the yoga and the tantric sex.
Yeah, I know. I was going to say, I think it's the tantric stuff.
Isn't that his thing?
Last year, Stern did an interview with Billy Idol, and he was like, how'd you get into rock and roll? Well, I was kind of aimless. I was 14, and I had I was having sexual encounters and into drugs. He's like, how did you even get the motivation to get into music? Most people become rock stars for sex and drugs. You already had it at 14. Well, there you go. It takes all kinds. Here we are. It's a big week in the world. It's November, and gosh, it's daylight savings time is the worst. It's just like,
the worst.
It freaks me out. It looks so dark. And but to bring hope in the midst of daylight savings time, we have a big announcement to make. Sarah's book is coming out.
It's finished. It's
finished.
Yeah.
She finished the introduction yesterday. Sarah, how does it feel?
How does it feel?
Terrifying. It feels terrifying. Yeah. It's exciting. It's just, it's a lot. I'm excited to be done with it and to see what happens next. So it's cool. I'm just glad it's done. I'm grateful for Mockingbird to be the ones to publish it, and super grateful to David Zoll, who's been a good encourager and a football coach all summer long. So yeah,
it's always amazing when these things actually are finished.
Yeah,
how did that happen? It didn't exist a little while ago.
Yeah.
So kudos to you, Reverend Condon.
What's even more amazing is making a football analogy with David Zoll, a man who has probably watched one Super Bowl in his life.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah, but I would talk to him on the phone when I was having a tough time, and he would always be like, just get out there and hustle, Condon. I mean, that's what it felt like. So I was like,
pen to paper.
Yeah.
You don't make it to the Hall of Fame without a dirty uniform.
Absolutely.
So, what do we got on the docket this week, David?
Well, it's been a pretty boring week in the world events, as we all know. Kidding. But in fact, just to say up front that, Scott, you wrote something on the website about the election I thought was really powerful, and Thomas Beckett. I put
great sermon material. If you don't know what you're going to preach this Sunday, it's worth looking at.
Yeah, and it really, definitely. And I put my oar in yesterday, and then Sarah has something going up this morning. So I think we've all kind of made some of our thoughts or feelings known. There's a lot to say, of course, but today we're also trying to see what else is going on, kind of catch up with the rest of our lives. But the first thing we're looking at, or for in the podcast today, at least in another weekends, is this piece in the New Yorker about the future. What is the sort of left-leaning late night comedy, is it futile? And what do we make of the sort of huge surge in late night comedy and how strident and political it all became? Did it actually do anything? And that the article itself is interesting, but the reason it stuck out to me was because of the quote from Stephen Colbert speaking on Showtime Live when he said, "How did our politics get so poisonous? I think it's because we overdosed, especially this year. We drank too much of the poison. You take a little bit of it so you can hate the other side, and it tastes kind of good. And you like how it feels. And there's a gentle high to the condemnation, right? You know you're right. You know you're right." Then he went on, finding his chair. Politics used to be something we thought about every 4 years, maybe 2 years if you didn't have a lot of social life. And that's good we didn't think about it that much because it left room in our lives for other things and for other people. Now politics is everywhere, and that takes up precious brain space we could be using to remember all the things we actually have in common. So whether your side won or lost, we don't have to do this shit for a while. And he talked about sort of growing up and, Nixon was elected and sort of, yeah, we thought about Nixon, but it wasn't like he was probably pretty young at this point, but it wasn't as dominant. And I've certainly noticed this. And you don't have to be on social media to know this. People who can't get out of bed or people who feel like, Jesus Christ has come again. I mean, everyone, there's such a strong
people who are going and recording on the podcast without showering or shaving.
Yes, but to me, I don't want to downplay. We've said a lot of things, and there's so much to be said, and I really think it's an emotional time for people to process whatever it is they're feeling. But you do see a kind of the degree to which we've made politics into religion and the be all end all, the absolute. I think that's a little bit what he's getting at, and clearly we're living in a different world, but I did find that to be at least a hopeful takeaway for the time being. Not that people should stop talking about politics or thinking about it, but that there are other things going on in life where there's common ground and space and human experience and hurt and need and wounds and love and joy. And maybe my prayer for us all is that we can have some kind of window into that the rest of our lives. Because wasn't that the refrain from everyone beforehand? I just can't wait till this is over and we can kind of get on with our life. Well, now it's over, and maybe at least for the time being, take your kids to soccer.
Amen. Yeah, so on election day, I had to take our kids with me to vote because I would not have otherwise, to be honest with you. I don't begrudge anybody who takes their kids to vote, but I really wanted this to be as low-key as possible in their lives. So I took the kids to vote, and we had friends from our church who we're very close with, and she had called me and said, hey, and they had a 3-year-old staying with them. And she called, and she's got teenage son. She said, hey, we've got my sister's 3-year-old in town, and I've made mac and cheese, hot dogs, and hamburgers. Do you want to come over? So I brought my kids over. Her kids are all there. Our husbands eventually showed up. We opened up some wine. Disney Junior was on the television. And we sat there and we told each other stories about our honeymoons. And it felt like and I have no idea who they voted for. Literally have no idea who they voted for. And it felt like our own like quiet protest. I don't know. She kept saying it was a bubble. Like the next day I saw this friend and she's like, I wish we could just go back to that bubble right now. And I'm like, but maybe that's actually life, right? Like maybe that's life. Maybe not us like all being upset and it was so wonderful to me to be with friends who, even when the results were rolling in, we knew we had kids with us and we knew we didn't need that anxiety and they didn't need that anxiety. And so, that pirate show that's on Disney Junior was blaring like,
Jake and the
Neverland Pirates. Exactly. So, a lot of that.
Yeah, I had a similar experience on election day. I mean, voting was a nice experience. Like, there were so many people there, and we laughed and joked. And there's a guy at our polling place that brings coffee and donuts for everybody, like boxes and boxes. And he's been doing it for 25 years. And we're all standing in line, and Lindy points out that it's a Pennsylvania law that if you absentee vote, if you have to have your name and address posted. So Lindy's like, okay, anybody that's into burglary here you go. He was just out of town for an extended time. So everybody's just laughing. And it was a moment that felt very human and felt very, I felt so civically minded that I actually picked up somebody else's dog poop. Like I was, as my dogs were relieving themselves, I thought somebody didn't do this. And normally I just curse them and say, who does that? And I just said, you know what? It's going to be okay. And then I went to New York to record this interview with a guy named Jim Nabel, who I posted yesterday, because it was a long interview, like an hour long. And he played music, and it was so lovely. And I just was like, look, this just needs to be a standalone thing. And we're huddled together in the sacristy of St. George's Church while everybody is making out to be the apocalypse is going on. And we're just talking. And, I had never interviewed a singer-songwriter before. Mm. And it was such a human experience. And then he would play music, and he's a very gifted musician, and he's just playing it felt like just for me, in that moment it was. And he and I the next day talked, just via text message. And I said, I think I'm just going to push it out there as a standalone, post-election hangover episode, because in that moment of human connection, it didn't feel like the end of the world, and even even in moments that it's funny because shows like The Walking Dead show us even after the end of the world, there's still room for humanizing moments. That's why we like post-apocalyptic television, right? Because it shows us that there are graced moments where actually sometimes when all the social constraints and things that serve to construct our identity pass away, sometimes there's a shred by grace of humanity left in us. And so I felt like thanks to Jim Nabel, and he wrote, for our listeners, I encourage you to check it out because it concludes at the end. He wrote a song called Mockingbird because he knew we had planned 2 weeks ago to do this. And his 6-year-old son wrote the lyric. He was messing around with his guitar. So his 6-year-old son, just hashtag feel like a failure. Athanasius wrote the Nicene Creed at 25. Jim Nabel's son is writing songs at 6. And I'm not going to say my age, but I haven't showered or shaved.
Mockingbird, I will be free. I will be free without you watching me. Not in a cage, I want to go every place for the world.
Moving on.
Yeah, moving on. Next, we're going straight to the heart of kind of the more personal side of things with one of Heather Havrilesky's featuring a couple things she's written in the past couple weeks. This is one of her Ask Polly columns for the New York Magazine, and the headline is, I failed at everything I worked to achieve. And Heather is fielding a letter from a law student, a third-year law student, a young woman who just feels like a complete failure, who hasn't gotten a job, even though she's had great grades, and feels like there's something about her that continues to circle around failure. She says, basically, I vacillate between sometimes simultaneously occupying two deeply dysfunctional emotional spaces. The first of these being, I'm basically worse than Hitler. Not very smart, completely deserving of these failures, and doomed to an unfulfilling career. And second, I am better and smarter than everyone else in law school. Everyone here is boring anyway and only smart in a one-dimensional way, so screw law and everyone in it. And Heather gives this wonderful long response, which is one of her classic discursive, deeply empathetic. And she opens up, and this is before the news about Leonard Cohen, which I know we're going to talk about less. She opens up by saying, sooner or later, we all discover that life is not a never-ending victory march. I don't know if I think she was probably quoting Hallelujah. Life is not a victory march. It's a cold and broken. It's one of the most interesting things you'll ever see is someone describing a disappointment. And she goes through this and talks about her own life, and she gets to the meat of it, which is when she says, failing and being rejected are so good for you. And I don't know if she's, we can sort of interpret it as also sort of just receiving a no, maybe, and that's what people have gotten politically this week, or the opposite. Anyway, she says, once you accept that this is an important time, a glorious, amazing, promising time when you're defeated, that you can lean into your failure instead of trying to hide it on the outside while eating yourself alive on the inside. And she says, shit never stops happening. You do not arrive somewhere someday where no more SHIT happens. This is how it feels to be an adult. And if you accept that and embrace it, you will see how much happiness flows out of every crisis. If you fear it and get defensive and hardened and walk away instead of facing it head on, you will only learn how to become a perfectionist who quits and hides and is plagued by fear forever. This is sort of the final paragraph here. She says, this is the skill you need more than any other. Learning to face yourself in all your wild anger, in all your self-hatred and fear and anxiety, and learning to face an uncertain future. Everyone has to do this over and over again. You are lucky to be here, trust me. This is perfect training for your career. Before you become a helper, you are going to know how it feels to need help. Before you become a helper, you're going to know how it feels to need help. Now, that's, maybe sounds a little trite in some ways, but I think she's right, and that failure is one of our great teachers. Suffering, life is not one long march towards progress and life eternal. It is usually a series of defeats in which what is true and real comes into focus. But what did you guys take from this exchange?
Well, so I got kicked out of a class. I think I've told you guys this. My last year of seminary, my last semester of seminary, and because I commuted and had a kid and everything, I took exactly enough classes. So when I got kicked out of a class, graduation was super up in the air, and it was totally my fault. I had missed more class than I should have. And I didn't realize that it was taught by a pastoral care professor from Yale and a Yale psychologist, she will have you know. And so it was a pastoral care class that I got kicked out of. And I know, it was crazy. And when I
feel like this is where we need a laugh track.
It was really messy though. I checked my email and I got this email and she said, we've been keeping track and you've missed, it was probably 3 classes, and we want you to know that this is the policy, and so we're going to have to ask you to leave the class. So I drove in from Westchester County, so lucky that I did not get in a car accident. I was driving like bad out of hell, and I got there and was just like crying in front of them and in front of the class too. Like I was in front of my peers, and the professor said to me, she's like, well, I feel like which was so powerful to have a Yale psychologist say to me in front of other people. She's like, I feel like you're a little unstable right now. And I was like, that's accurate. And then she's like, you should just take the semester off and then come back and take the class next spring. And I was like, so my husband's moved to Texas. And I'm going to need to move there with him, with our small child. So it was like it was a total mess. I ended up taking a class here in Houston at another seminary. I didn't even know I could do that, but I managed to do that summer, which was a great experience. Scott, I kept reading this piece and both hating this young woman and also thinking of the podcast you sent me about 3s on the Enneagram, which I am, and how good failure is for us. And I think this is true for everyone. And specifically, sometimes how good public failure is for us. Like when we have to say to people, as this young woman says in this piece, like, what do I say to family? What do I say to friends? Because it's so jarring when when great forgiveness and understanding meets great failure. And anyway, I kept thinking of that as I was reading it. Also the advice Heather Haverleski gives her about sort of knowing the ambient noise of your upbringing and how important that is in the midst of when we face these major things. Because I actually think the ambient noise of your upbringing can really make you realize that maybe you're making a poor choice, but it can also, some days the thing that gets me through. For example, like when everybody's been very bleak about this election, I'm like, hey, my grandmother's made it through the Depression, y'all. So like, we're going to, that was the ambient noise of my childhood. Like, hey, your grandmother's made it through being widows and the Depression. Like, I think you can figure out science class. So, yeah.
Sarah, I can't believe that story didn't make it into the book, but I'm glad people have it for posterity now.
Yeah.
I got a text message from a friend who's black and pretty accomplished guy, and education. He's an administrator and he's just a very successful guy and a dear friend. And he texted me and he said, "Did you see Donald Trump today with the president? His posture was different. I mean, maybe I'm being overly hopeful, but maybe the office will change him." And I thought about, as I was reading Heather's piece, I say Heather like I know her, but I thought about the book Failure of Nerve, which is, if anybody is listening who's a pastor or a leader or is just trying to figure out how to not kill your coworkers or your children or your spouse or anybody. David, as your father said recently in a sermon, as an analogy, have you ever been at a cocktail party, you've hosted it, and at the end, as you're loading a dishwasher, your friend is helping you, and you just want to take the carving knife and stab them in the throat? I mean, you've had this experience, right? So the whole point of Friedman in The Failure of Nerve is that he says, what we say, we want more empathetic leaders. And he says empathy can kill a leader. Because most of the time when we're saying empathy, what we really mean is mirror our anxiety. He said really good leaders know themselves and their failures and their anxieties. And then when they hit hard things, can actually be a calming presence. And I'll tell you, watching The Crown recently, we just binge watched it.
Yeah, we did too.
And there's this scene where the Queen is learning and saying to Winston Churchill, "Winston, you are the efficient, I am the dignified. You are responsible for governing, but I am responsible to make governance possible." In Barack Obama, we saw they're in a rare moment in American public life. We saw the efficient and the dignified merge. And this is, a validation of everything that. And maybe on our 10th anniversary, it's gracious that we get to see it, of everything Mockingbird has been saying, that here's a guy facing somebody that questioned the legitimacy of his identity, of his kids, of his, and he met him with dignity. And it apparently was humanizing. It was, he actually seemed to invite a genuine I thou, and they talked for 90 minutes. And at the end of the 90 minutes, Trump said, this is a good man. He's a great person who I will actually look forward to seeking his counsel. And then again, Obama said, "Don't take the first question. Go with the last ones." And again, he said, "Good man, good man." It's just the only thing that humanizes is unconditional love.
Wow.
And that lesson was learned through lots of struggle with his own racial identity, his own failures. I mean, driving to his first Democratic convention, humiliated because he almost ran out of gas. I mean, this is a president who has known that the one who is forgiven much and knows much about themselves. And as David, you said, reality is always a good thing because you find God in reality. This is a man who's lived in reality and apparently was able to give people a glimpse of what is really real.
Yeah.
Build a stairway to heaven with a prince or a vagabond. And may you never love me in vain. And in my heart you will remain forever young, forever young, forever young.
Well, Scott, what you say also reminds me, this is just where I woke up this morning is not thinking about the election so much as thinking about Leonard Cohen. And he's got a song, one of my favorite songs of his is called The Future. And a line in there, "I've heard the stories, heard them all, but love's the only engine of survival." I think that's where my mind goes. And Cohen is someone who is operating on such a deep level that it feels silly to try to almost temporalize him because he was tapped into something so deep, and what he was tapped into, of course, was a lot of divinity, a lot of God. I mean, he was a man who was sort of not only a Buddhist and a Jew, but he was Christ haunted, and you can't get away from that in his lyrics and his words. I mean, one of my also in The Future, he says, "Give me back the Berlin Wall, give me Stalin and St. Paul, give me Christ or give me Hiroshima." I mean, I think this guy's dealing with some very deep things. We also have the Victory March. I mean, Scott, Sarah, you recommended it to me, Scott, so I'm sure you heard Malcolm Gladwell's podcast about Hallelujah and how it kind of came to be and all the permutations that song went into. But that song has become such a secular hymn because it's not actually very secular. It's actually very deeply about, David and the theology of the cross. I see that in Cohen's people who know his song "Come Healing." We sing it in church all the time. "Oh, gather up the brokenness." I think it's a hymn for our times, for our country that's so divided. "Oh, gather up the brokenness and bring it to me now. The fragrance of those promises you never dared to vow. The splinters that you carry, the cross you left behind. Come healing of the body, come healing of the mind. And let the heavens hear it, the penitential hymn. Come healing of the spirit, come healing of the limb." And I think that's our prayer that he has put into words. I could continue to spout Cohen all day long.
Isn't it remarkable? Some of the people who, on my news feed, I have so many people on my news feed in the wake of the election. A lot of my friends are, consider themselves very progressive people from Yale. I also have a ton of friends who are Southern Jews, Jews from Mississippi, and this election was really, really hard for them. And isn't it, in some ways, it feels like God's timing that Leonard Cohen would have died this week so that there's just this incredible reminder and resurgence of all these things that he said, all these songs that he sung, all these poems that he's written, because those same people are posting them right now. I mean, it's a point of healing and of comfort for them. It makes me very grateful.
I want to. Here's another one from "Tell me again when the filth of the butcher is washed in the blood of the lamb. Tell me again when the rest of the culture has passed through the eye of the camp. Tell me again when I'm clean and sober. Tell me again when I've seen through the horror. Tell me again. Tell me over and over. Tell me that you love me then. Amen." Or we have "Show me the place." These are all from his album Old Ideas, which is this album before the most recent one. "Show me the place. Help me roll away the stone. Show me the place. I can't move this thing alone. Show me the place where the word became a man. Show me the place where the suffering began."
That's incredible.
I only have, I want to quote from my own contemporary, what is becoming my own Talmudic set of friends. Jim Nabel, it's funny because Unorthodox calls him the Jubidor, and he talks about this. His mother's not Jewish.
Oh.
His father's whole, so it's this strange conflicting thing where half of his family is Jewish, and but a deeply spiritual guy. And he said, in a piece here for Tablet, he said, I used to hope in vain to be Bob Dylan. By the way, he actually in this interview got me to sing like a Rolling Stone, at least a couple verses of it. So I used to hope in vain to be Bob Dylan or the next Bob Dylan or just Dylan-esque. Then I realized it was pointless. Bob Dylan achieved his immortality in his early 20s, and everything he did thereafter, while often spectacular, just built on the myth of his halcyon youth. And so at the age of 40, I've curbed my dreams of becoming the next Bob Dylan. I still, though, find it entirely reasonable to hope to be the next Leonard Cohen, who turns 82 today. And later in the piece, he says, as a 24-year-old singer with a guitar in New York, a performance of my serious songs garnered audible whispers of he's like Leonard Cohen, which thrilled me like nothing else. But Cohen didn't just influence me as a writer or solo performer. When I listened to his 1979 concert album released in 2000, I paid careful attention to the way he graciously introduced his individual band members in the middle of the songs, after their solos, or even just a particularly nice riff. That was Roscoe Beck on fretless bass, he'd say. I did the same when I got my band, the Randy Bandits, going. But then he says, while his influence was great through my band's peak years, it wasn't until we started slipping away from each other, as bands do, that I found myself truly needing the example of Leonard Cohen. The loss of my band coincided with the birth of my first son. My days were consumed with swapping, adjunct teaching hours, and childcare, as my wife worked from home and swapped equally. The songs I wrote were meant for an audience of one, my infant son, who usually began crying the moment I started singing. One hopeless afternoon, I put a DVD of Leonard Cohen's 2009 London show on, and my son was miraculously transfixed. I once again found myself studying the songs and performance style of a man now old enough to make jokes about having once been a 60-year-old kid with a crazy dream. My son took to wearing a hat like Cohen's, inexplicably referred to as his Druka Mama hat, and insisted on hearing a playlist of Cohen's songs to ease him into night-night. I drew on the power of the Druks Mama. Really don't ask. When I asked a female friend to sing with me as I lined up some gigs to explore my more blatantly Cohen-esque songs. This phase may or may not have passed, and now my son prefers Adele, to each their own. I think, this sense, I love that he says when things were slipping away. That the beauty of Cohen is an artist that's beauty is in slipping away, in the slipping away. Like this, the Frank Lake view of reality, that when we look at our humanity as a bucket that ought to contain something good, we're screwed. But when the bottom gets knocked out, the bucket, it ruins it as a container. It makes it a channel for the life and energy of the living God. So, and also, we should just read Liel's book today. I almost want to just do that, get on Periscope or something and just read aloud Liel's book, The Broken Hallelujah. Liel Leibowitz, if you want to delve more deeply into Cohen, he's written the book about it.
Come healing.
Thanks for listening to the Mockingcast. As always, you can find any of the content we reference on our website, mbird.com. If you like it, please go over to iTunes, give us a rating, maybe even write a review, or pass it on to a friend via social media. We exist because of the generosity, enthusiasm, and support of you, our listeners and readers, and for that, we are forever grateful. Thanks again for listening, and have a great weekend.
Behold the gates of mercy in arbitrary space, and none of us deserving the cruelty or the grace. O solitude of longing, where love has been confined, come healing of the body, come healing of the mind.
Oh, see the darkness healed,
that tore the light apart, come healing of the reason, come healing of the heart.